welcome to week 10. And we have one more unit which we'll cover primarily today, which is to look at a number of other victim groups, particularly Sinti and Roma, victims of euthanasia, and gay and lesbian victims. And I'll focus primarily on the latter in the second half of the class. I also wanted to just say something about Thursday, which is we're going to talk primarily about a number of memorials. I may add a couple other links on there of things I'm going to speak about, but primarily examples of the physical spaces of memory and commemoration. And these will all just be links to information online that you can take a look at. I'll also provide on Thursday some maybe more personal reflections about the class, and also interested to hear from you about how you think the ideas of the class apply more broadly. Certainly thinking about the large kind of haunting question about why we study the past in the first place, and often we generally say it's to learn from it. So what do we learn? And if we learn something, what do we do with that knowledge? So this, I think, is really a challenge, beyond the 10 weeks of this class. And so I'd be curious to hear from you, both what do we learn from the past, why does it matter, how do we apply that knowledge? Okay, in terms of just, practicalities, a week from today, right here in this room, starting at 11:30, so interesting. It doesn't start at 11, I don't know why. But Ursa has your exam starting at 11:30, so I'll be here as well as your TAs. We're going to distribute these paper exams to you. You will bring blue books with you or some other bound form of paper. You will not bring books with you. You will not bring your computer. You will not bring, notes. You should bring a writing utensil. The exam will take, you'll have up to 3 hours. I don't know if it'll take you that long. It may. I think at this point there's 10 questions, and they're divided between short answers and what I would say slightly longer answers. And I'll give you some examples in a second. It'll all be written. It's not multiple choice. It's all short essays, either 1 paragraph length essays or like a page to 2 page length essays. And by that I mean written pages. You'll also have some flexibility on the exam because you can leave out, I think, 2 questions. I'll give you 12 questions and you pick 10. And one of them will be extra credit as well. So there's a lot of, I should say the exam is largely a chance for you to demonstrate your knowledge. It's not me trying to get you and test you on, sort of micro issues of the class. It's a chance for you to basically say, look, I've been present, I've engaged with this material, I've thought through it, I want to synthesize it, and it's an opportunity for you to really demonstrate what you've learned. So in that spirit, I will often provide you with information where I identify what the material is. I may even reproduce, one of the documents. I'll say, here it is. We've talked about this. Provide an analysis. So obviously the analysis part is going to be what you do. So let me give you a couple of examples of that, because I know you probably want to know. So I also put this on the CCLE notes from last week, so maybe you looked at it already. Yes, it's in the whole quarter. Yes, I realize we covered a lot in the whole quarter, but if you go through the slides, you also realize there's units. The rise of fascism and anti-Semitism. This is kind of what we did in the first couple weeks. The perpetrators, the victims, questions around memory, questions of representation in different media. These are kind of like big things that we sort of dealt with. And so you can sort of imagine you'll probably have a question on the history of fascism. You'll probably have a question about the perpetrators. You'll probably have a question about victims. It's pretty straightforward. Like I said, you'll have these short answer question and these short essays, and there'll be some flexibility. So, give you an example. This is what I mean by a short answer question. Define genocide and discuss the history of the term. Hopefully the term is familiar to you. Hopefully you know something about when it was coined, what it means, the key terms we've been studying, like Holocaust. What is that? Genocide. What is that? A paragraph. Or I'll give you a film clip. I'll actually show you a clip on a film. You know, it'll be, again, something very obvious. You've seen it because I've talked about it, you know. And I'll ask you about the film techniques that the director's using. I'll ask you about, you know, maybe the politics of representation or something like that. Or you're like, gosh, we only read one graphic novel in this class. We know what it is, and it's obviously it's mouse. So if I say identify the work below, I mean, most likely I'm going to identify it for you. But I will ask you something about the way in which this representation is taking place. You'll provide an interpretation in a paragraph. I may ask you to do something comparatively in the larger essays. I don't know. But here's an example of what I mean by a larger essay. So I gave you the document, right? I even identify it for you. I say, look, here's an excerpt from the Wannsee Conference. I want you to assess the language in these protocols and its relationship to the perpetrators. What can we learn about the perpetrators by the language that they use here? And you saw the film about this. You also read the primary document. We talked extensively about Adolf Eichmann. We talked extensively about this event, this conference that took place in Berlin. If you would remember a date, that would be great, right? And ideally, you get it in the right year, so 1942. You don't need to know a lot of dates in the class, but you need to know the basic ones. You should know 1933. You should know 1939. You should know 1942. You should know 1945. This is primarily the period we've been talking about. It would be nice if you could spell the names of the key people correctly. But if we can recognize the spelling, that's good. If we have no idea what you're talking about, not as good. Okay? I don't really think the exam is strenuous, but it is comprehensive. Yes, there are 10 questions. I think at this point, like I said, maybe 7 are short answer and 3 are kind of essays. I think that's most likely it'll be. But again, in both cases, you have a choice to leave one out. Questions? Easiest way to review is go through the PowerPoint slides. And my lectures, especially if you missed a day. Okay, good. So we're going to turn to our theme for the day, which is about 3 other victim groups, and also start by talking about sort of the post-war situation with regard to reparations, or what in German, there's a beautiful long word for this, Wiedergutmachung, meaning making good again, doing good. So some of the very first attempts by the West German government after the war to make good were to establish a series of funds, particularly to help survivors, and many of which were used to help survivors rebuild and relocate their lives in Israel, the United States, Canada, and other places. This is largely because, as you know, in the immediate post-war period, you have millions of people that survived who lost their families and ended up displaced. They couldn't go home. You heard this from every Holocaust survivor that you talked to. They couldn't go home because their communities had been destroyed. Their families had been destroyed. Sometimes their assets had been looted. Sometimes their houses had been taken away, expropriated by the state or even their neighbors in some cases. They ended up in displaced persons camps, often in the immediate post-war period up until the mid-40s, or rather late 40s, 46, 47, 48. And most of the countries on the Allied side were making efforts to help to find a way for the survivors to rebuild their lives. And the West German government, after 1949, began conversations with Allied powers of establishing reparations funds, and one of the major ones is simply called the Claims Conference, which is a large group of funds that were paid out to Jewish victims, largely in the form of pension funds for survivors of concentration camps. Some survivors also received lump sum payments. Often this was in the form of a couple $1,000s. That would help them relocate to another country, often to Israel. So in the case of a 1952 agreement, each survivor received $3,000. But we're talking about a lot of survivors. We're talking about nearly 500,000 survivors and a payment from Germany of around $1.5 billion. So I should turn this on so you can see it broader. Sorry about that. There. The other major kind of reparation that was made in the immediate post-war period was funds for property that was stolen, plundered, or destroyed by the Nazis. And this is still something that's going on to this day. If you followed any of the debates, or really debates in some ways, but really the struggle to return works of art to heirs and families where those works had been looted, this is still an ongoing and really still very contentious part of history. But about $3 billion was paid for restitution for properties, businesses, and other things that were stolen or looted. I should say that the vast majority was not paid. It sounds like a large amount of money, but if we're thinking about millions of people whose property was destroyed, the vast majority of survivors received virtually nothing for this. Other major reparations happened in the late 1990s, and particularly a number of funds that the German government created, mainly for needy Holocaust survivors at the end of their lives. And much of this actually came from funds that were provided by German companies that had benefited from slave labor. So you might remember that virtually every slave labor camp, all the survivors who we talked to, with the exception of Xenon, were in one. And these companies got free labor. So it may have been the IG Farben, it may have been Krupp, it may have been Bayer, major companies that you've heard of. You know, Bayer makes aspirin. Well, they also had employed slave laborers, as did Krupp. They make coffee makers and other things, as did IG Farben, and many companies that had benefited. And so they set up a fund for paying back survivors for slave labor. But again, the amount, these are largely symbolic. The amount that most Holocaust survivors received was a couple $1,000s. So these are largely symbolic, reparations. I'm going to talk about one particular case because it'll take us to other victim groups today, and that's the Swiss banks case. And it happens to be the one that I personally know the best because I think I mentioned in the syllabus, I had written the historical background for the persecution of homosexuals for the judge that was adjudicating this case. And this was right before I came to UCLA. It was 2001. And I was working with an international group of advocacy group called the Pink Triangle Coalition, which was 7 international organizations who were representing gay men who had been persecuted for being homosexual by the Nazis. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go forward. But what was important about this case, it was the first time in any of the reparations debates or reparations cases that you had other victim groups represented, and that they could make a claim to having suffered harm and therefore are eligible for getting reparations. This didn't exist in any of the other cases prior to that. And that's really is very striking. Now, granted, Jews made up the vast majority of victims of the Holocaust. And so, if we're talking, say, just strictly by numbers of 6 million Jews killed and maybe somewhere around the same number of survivors, another 6 million, you're talking about numbers that are exponentially larger than these other groups. With regard to gypsies, we know of around 100,000 who were killed by the Nazis and another about 100,000 killed by other European powers. With regard to Jehovah's Witnesses, socially and mentally handicapped, and homosexuals, we're talking about numbers in the tens of thousands. Now, these are not insignificant, obviously, but in terms of adjudicating how the funds would be divided, the idea was that based statistically on the number of victims and survivors, statistically about 90% of the victims were Jews. And so the other 10% were divided between gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, socially and mentally handicapped, and homosexuals. Now, a couple of those terms are not so politically correct today. We don't usually say gypsies. Nazis did. We usually refer to them as Sinti and Roma, referring to the language, Romani, that's spoken, and Sinti being the particular tribal affiliation of the people, ethnic group that had migrated from northern India into Europe, primarily along the Balkans and into some areas of Germany. With regard to socially and mentally disabled, I'll talk about this in a moment, but this was in some ways a group that was targeted as the very kind of the most systematic from the beginning in terms of trying to like create a racially pure Germany. And this was a group that was primarily euthanized and sometimes sterilized. With regard to homosexuals, again, we usually say gay and lesbian. The Nazis were only talking about gay men. It's important to know that because there was no systematic persecution of lesbians, and the laws that they enacted didn't target lesbians. Now, one other note is that lesbians were sometimes unsystematically targeted, and I'll talk about that in a minute, in terms of their what they called asocial behavior, and sometimes they were forced, and we know of cases of a couple hundred where they were forced to work in camp brothels for SS men. So they would be eligible for some remuneration, although we know of no cases of lesbians who came forward to claim reparations. In any case, for this case, we're talking, it's extraordinary, from the late 1990s that there were still a unique number of 457,000 claims, all of which, the individual claims, which tells you the extent of the, I mean, this is now, you know, we're talking decades after the Holocaust, that all $1.25 billion was paid out to survivors from these 5 different victim groups. Now, where did the money come from? Why Swiss banks? Well, it was because the Nazis had laundered assets into Swiss banks, that the companies themselves derived labor where the assets were put in Swiss banks, and the assets the Nazis looted, bank accounts as well as property, all that was deposited into Swiss banks, and the Swiss banks held that and made interest on it for almost 40 years. So that's where the money is. That's why this case was looking at actual labor and funds that were held rightly by these groups, or that these groups were slave laborers who worked for companies that benefited, and therefore, you know, over the years that money sat there, garnered interest, and the settlement of $1.25 billion was what was determined. Okay. So I'll talk about the 3 groups that I want to talk about today. So first, the Sinti and Roma. So I had mentioned just a minute ago that this refers to both a language and a tribal ethnic identity of a group that wandered originally in the 14th, 15th century to southern Europe, originally from India. We're not talking about huge numbers. There's a small ethnic minority within Germany, 26,000 in 1933. I should say that the vast majority of them were killed or sterilized. And, you know, in terms of numbers, you know, Jews were not a major group either. I mean, 535,000 is less than 1%. Germany had a population, to remind you at this time, 67 million. So 67 million Germans, 2 kind of very small minorities. In terms of homosexuals, if the numbers, you know, 10% is right, you know, which is sometimes a number given, you're talking about vastly, you know, increased numbers of gay and lesbian people. Interestingly, the policy with regard to gypsies was a little different than Jews. That is to say, racially pure Sinti and Roma were actually not systematically targeted. They were considered to be inferior. They were considered to be like subhuman. They were stripped of their citizenship by the Nuremberg laws, which are the same laws that stripped Jews of their citizenship. But for Himmler and Hitler, the problem with gypsies was the mixing. They thought that if they were to mix with purebred Germans, that then they would produce degenerate offspring, and this was their danger. Now, they thought this about Jews too, but it didn't really matter if they were pure or impure, because they always thought they were, you know, bad. But pure gypsies, they thought were kind of a unique racial group, just a sub you know, group. Now, the Germans started enacting laws as early as 1933 to create what is known as criminal lists. And this is very important, I think, because there were 3 main groups that were considered criminals in Germany. Gypsies, homosexuals, Jews. Jews were generally considered by definition as a group to all be criminals. And so in some ways, creating a criminal list was like a superfluous activity. You didn't have to create another list because they were guilty as a group. Gypsies maybe a little less so, and so what they started doing was making lists of gypsies who were considered lazy, criminal, maybe disobedient, asocial, a number of kind of words that were used to describe them. And Himmler referred to them as a kind of a gypsy plague. even though, again, the number that we're talking about is so microscopic, perhaps the most residing in the outskirts of Berlin. In 1936, he introduces legislation for fighting the gypsy nuisance, and this really is about criminal reporting, purity tests, and we know with the Nuremberg laws, the revocation of citizenship. Now, there was a discussion as to whether there would be a final solution to the gypsy problem. It was articulated the same way as a final solution to the Jewish problem, and they decided not to systematically annihilate the entire group, but that there was a concern about racial purity and that gypsies would be sent to concentration camps. We know that the Nazis killed about 90,000, and the Romanians killed almost all the rest. It turns out that many were in the former Yugoslavia, Romania, Serbia, Croatia, and during the war, those countries participated in a kind of racial purification as well. And in fact, more gypsies were killed by those countries than by Nazis in Nazi concentration camps. Now, one of the things that I think is particularly important for dealing with the so-called quote-unquote gypsy plague or gypsy nuisance is the introduction of sterilization. So this was done systematically in Germany, not only for gypsies, but also for Afro-German children, sometimes called Rhineland bastards. And again, we're not talking about, we're talking about a small minority, primarily living on the border between France and Germany, but the idea being that miscegenation was the fear here. And so the women were systematically sterilized, and this applied to Afro-Germans as well as to gypsies. This wasn't primarily what they were doing with Jews at this time. And this is interesting because the concern in the mid-1930s and like 1935 to 38, the concern here is really German purity, racial purity, and the fear of miscegenation and the degeneracy of the German race. And so that's why sterilization is introduced. Shortly after, in 1939, right at the beginning of the war, the Germans introduced euthanasia. And this is a program where they began killing physically and mentally disabled Germans and also Austrians, because again, the fear is that if they were to reproduce, they would be introducing things to the gene pool that would potentially undermine Aryan strength. And so this program called the T4 program is really the first time that in the Nazi period you have a systematic killing, and this is before the concentration camps open outside of Germany. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this program briefly because it's in some ways it's another piece of the the complex puzzle here. So this is a program, and I think I had mentioned this when I talked about church resistance a couple weeks ago. This is a program where, again, the concern was the gene pool. They were concerned with physically and mentally disabled Germans and Austrians, particularly people who suffered from congenital diseases like Down syndrome or dementia or had physical disabilities, paralysis and other things. They euthanized about 70,000 people throughout Germany and Austria by gas, carbon monoxide, and lethal injections. And this was primarily what sparked the largest amount of outcry from the churches during this period. So you might remember the Confessing Church and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Niemöller, some of the pastors that I talked about during the Resistance Week. This was what they were resisting, that the churches were places of sanctuary. Often the churches had asylums within the churches for people who had suffered these kind of mental or physical disabilities. The churches often saw part of their mission to help these people, many of whom had been in orphanages or abandoned by their parents. And the idea was that they were rounded up, about half of them, from churches and then euthanized involuntarily in Germany. So this was sometimes called, what Hitler called, life unworthy of life, meaning they're alive, but they don't deserve to live. And so this euthanasia, this mercy killing, so to speak, was not really merciful in that regard because it was not voluntary. it was involuntary. It was against the wishes of the families or the people themselves who may not even been able to express outrage. So this was in many ways, I mean, if we had to like put a pinpoint on the first use of gassings in Germany, it actually is not 1940, it's within Germany in 1939, and it's with regard to this euthanasia program. And this is also where a number of gypsies, we don't know the numbers, were killed, perhaps hundreds, perhaps thousands. There's simply not enough documentation. This is the guy who was in charge. He was actually tried in 1948 in a doctor's trial. Karl Brand, a medical doctor. He oversaw the entire euthanasia program. This is just one example of a euthanasia center. Most of them were established outside of major cities. This one in Austria at a castle. 18,000 people over the period of several years were euthanized there. And the idea was that Hitler had entrusted Dr. Brandt and another fellow with what he says, the responsibility of extending the authority of physicians, meaning they can do more than just take care of patients, they can now kill patients. Right? Again, the kind of Nazi euphemisms here, extending the responsibility of the authority of physicians, who, after critical diagnosis on the basis of human judgment, meaning they get to make a decision, are considered incurable and therefore granted, a mercy death. Essentially, again, a term here for a euphemism for euthanasia or just outright killing. So this is 39 to 41. This program is stopped in 1941, at least publicly stopped, because of outcry from many churches and also from the public who were aware of what was going on. They were considered to be, Germans who were being killed by the state, and so this program was not kept up, at least in the public eye, after 1941. And as you know, in fact, the gassing operations and the killing operations all shifted to the east. And they all shifted to the killing of Jews primarily in some of the early extermination camps like Chelmno and Belzec, and then finally after 1942, systematically with regard to the other extermination camps. There was a hand or a question I saw. This was a law in Germany. It stopped publicly after 1941, although we know that euthanasia continued to a certain extent in Germany, and you could say most of the efforts were focused then on the East, which is really not euthanasia at all, but just mass killing. Okay, so I'm going to turn to homosexuals, and again, I think the term homosexual sounds very medical, but we'll use it because it's the term the Nazis were using. So hopefully you had a chance to watch the film Paragraph 175, which is a film about a Nazi law. Paragraph 175 was a law that outlawed homosexuality, particularly male homosexuality. So the law, which actually goes back to 1871, says an unnatural sex act committed between persons of the male sex or by humans with animals is punishable by imprisonment. The loss of civil rights may be imposed. Now, a couple of things are striking here. One, it's a question of men, and then there's also, of course, the equation of bestiality and homosexuality, right, which is in the law itself. So it's as if homosexuality, bad, and bestiality, bad, same thing, or at least on the same kind of par, because they're contained in the same law. Now, the Nazis took this law, which had been subject to a lot of debate in the Weimar period, particularly by Magnus Hirschfeld, who I'll talk about in a second, and you maybe remember, was the person who founded the first gay rights organization in the world in 1897. They had been advocating for the repeal of this law for decades, and it looked as if in the 1920s it would have been repealed, but it didn't get repealed. When the Nazis came to power, not only in 1933 did they systematically ban homosexuality, destroy all homosexual organizations, outlaw publications, but they also strengthened this law to include any act of sexual indecency between men, meaning people who just were suspected of being gay could be arrested. If you hugged someone, you could be arrested. You didn't actually have to be caught having sex. And it also, they strengthened it to result in mandatory imprisonment and penal servitude. Now, in Austria, there actually was a law where lesbians were tracked. And we don't, again, know exactly the numbers here, but paragraph 129 in Austria referred not only to gay men, but also to lesbians. And in the Nazi worldview, lesbians were thought to be reformable, meaning they could still bear children. They could, And what generally happened, and this is itself another part of the horrific picture, is that lesbians were often forced into servitude for SS officers in camps and in camp brothels. And we know of a number, perhaps in the hundreds, perhaps more, who were raped and forced to bear children for the Nazi state. So they weren't systematically targeted and tracked. However, lesbians also suffered a tremendous fate by being forced to work in brothels and being raped. So that's kind of the broad picture of homosexuality. Now, take a step back and kind of look at some of the history of homosexuality in Germany prior to Nazism. And if you remember, the Weimar Republic, so the kind of the democratic republic that just existed before Nazi Germany, was a very liberal place, very progressive on lots of things, including homosexuality. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of gay clubs, organizations throughout Germany. You had a major gay rights group called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. Sounds like a funny name, but they thought that they could prove that homosexuality was scientifically part of the kind of human expression. And so that's why it's scientific, because they were trying to make a medical argument that it was natural and it was just a part of human expression. Magnus Hirschfeld himself was a doctor. He was Jewish, he was gay, he was a socialist. The Nazis obviously hated him for all those reasons. He was one of the first people targeted in 1933 when the Nazis came to power, and he happened to be out of the country. He never returned to Germany. It's probably a good thing, because he would certainly have been imprisoned or killed. Hirschfeld is interesting for us, and maybe the name is maybe not as well known as, say, like Freud, but should be, because he was not only the founder of this first gay and lesbian rights group, he was also a major advocate of women's rights and women's equality. And he had theories about sexuality that were very much ahead of their day. He talked about transgenderism, he talked about transvestitism, he talked about the multiplicity of sex and gender, that it wasn't a binary thing. It wasn't just men and women, heterosexual, homosexual, but there were many different expressions of sexuality and gender identity that he thought both were very fluid and were kind of more performative. And you had to look at different cultures, because different cultures had different understandings about gender and sexuality. It wasn't just one binary that human beings had. And so part of his work was anthropological. He studied the world. He brought scholars to Berlin. He actually went all over, I think visiting more than 100 countries, to look at different forms of gender and sexuality, across the world. And one of the things he found was, a binary thinking about sexuality makes no sense. That was one of his major arguments. To think of only two, men and women, homosexual, heterosexual, is really very reductive. The first gay magazine in the world is published in Germany in 1896. It exists all the way through the Nazi period until it's banned in 1933. You have hundreds of periodicals, magazines, newspapers. You have clubs, bars, social organizations. And in many ways, Weimar Republic is a very experimental place for sexuality and sexual expression. Now, under the Nazis, you have proclamations like this by Hitler and Himmler that homosexuality is a crime against the German nation, punishable by death. And Himmler saying we have to eradicate homosexuality from the German nation. Now, one thing that's interesting about the case of homosexuals is that they primarily focused on Germany, Austria, and parts of Alsace-Lorraine, which they believed to belong to Germany, so parts of what were then France that were lost after World War I. They didn't track homosexuality in the Eastern territories. In fact, the Nazis, when they did track homosexuality, it was only within Germany, kind of like Greater Germany proper. Now, why exactly, I'm not sure, but this is simply just what happened. Now, with regard to the sequence of events, you have the Nazis coming to power in 1933. You have Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin closed, all of its records and books looted. They become the very things that are carted off. Hopefully you looked at the destruction, this article I gave you on the destruction of the Institute. The books that are burned come not only from the library at the University of Berlin, they also come from the Institute. And so major studies, anthropological works, medical works, but also literature, all carted off in vans and burned in a public conflagration in May of 1933. And this is something that Goebbels presides over. You have the closure of all gay establishments, the outlawing, and then here, just in 1934, you have the tracking of all suspected homosexuals by the state and the first deportations to Dachau, Lichtenberg, which is a sub-camp, and creating of criminal lists. We don't have all the records for this, but we know that hundreds of thousands of people were put on these criminal lists and then were subject to various kinds of penalties and imprisonments. You have the kind of more systematic deportation of homosexuals to camps. We don't know the exact numbers, but they vary from tens of thousands to maybe 50 or 100,000. And I should also say that homosexuals were subject to medical experiments that were very unique to homosexuals because the Germans thought they could cure homosexuality through a number of things, including hormone therapies and castration. And so they also did tests on homosexuals to strengthen the military because they thought that homosexuals were still Germans. They were still racially strong, but they had been subject to some kind of biological problem with regard to reproduction. So they could carry out other kinds of experiments on homosexuals that they couldn't do with regard to gypsies or Jews because racially they were different. Okay? Yeah. Yeah, denunciations. Yeah, exactly. Bribery and things like that. Yeah, absolutely. So it was by the state, by local police, by an organization set up by the Reich, which is a large umbrella organization, and as well as denunciations from neighbors. So in terms of convictions that we have, these are some of the numbers. We only have numbers for these 3 years of 100,000 homosexuals, being investigated. And you can kind of extrapolate from there, maybe hundreds of thousands. We simply don't know how many were tracked. But the numbers that we know from camps were probably around 50,000 sent to concentration camps. Maybe a third or so were killed by disease, by being murdered, by medical experiments, and so forth. So this is, and these were all men, by the way, all male homosexuals. Yeah, it's a good question. I actually don't really know the answer to that, why they only focused on Germany. But I think that the connection here was that they wanted, I believe it had something to do with German, again, racial kind of superiority, and that the idea would be that Germany represented the Aryans, and other countries where they took people in, they were already considered Poles, racially inferior, whereas Germans, I think, considered at the top. And the issue with homosexuals is they didn't bear children. And so if they could fix this problem, they would get more children for the state. And this is also why lesbians were considered, reformable, because they could bear children. So I suspect the reason is because of racial reasons. But I'm not exactly sure. Okay. So here's something that I wanted to say that differs with regard to the homosexual case than from all other victim groups, which is the fact that as many homosexuals that were put in concentration camps during the Nazi period, almost the same number were put in prisons and camps after the Nazis. And you say, whoa, what are you talking about? Yes. So between 1950 and 1969, many of the same exact people that had survived concentration camps were re-imprisoned in both West Germany and East Germany for the same crime of being gay. Now, this is really extraordinary because you can think what it would mean to re-imprison Jews after 1945. Obviously, once the war ended, we thought it's over. Well, in the case of gay men, they were systematically re-imprisoned and serving repeated jail sentences for the exact same crime that they supposedly had committed during the Nazi period. So what then happened between 1950 and 1969 is that you have 47,000 people being put back into prison for crimes, some of them serving prison sentences of 8 or 9 years. We know of no cases where any Jews or Gypsies were put in prison systematically by the state after 1945.
And this is in spite of the new Constitution in 49 that said, oh, you respect human rights.
That's right. Yeah, it's in spite of the new Constitution, which existed, to respect, everyone. So here's a group that is re-imprisoned. And this is obviously troubling, and it's only in 1985 does Germany actually acknowledge the persecution of homosexuals, both during the Nazi period as well as after. And that's really important, so after as well. Now, the laws stayed on the books in East Germany until 1968, 1969 in West Germany, and 1970 in Austria. And this is also, to my mind, this is one of the reasons why so few gay victims have come forward. I mean, it's kind of obvious. If for the next, almost 30 years, your country is outlawing homosexuality and re-imprisoning you, you're not going to come forward and say, hey, I want reparations for my suffering. I was sent to a camp, I did slave labor, I had my assets looted. They were never considered a persecuted class until 2000. So only with the Swiss bank's case, and this is why I think that case is so important, only with that case do you have the acknowledgement that homosexuals as a group were persecuted and therefore would have access to reparations. And so this was, when we look at the numbers of the number of gay victims, we know of basically almost 24 cases of gay victims who received funding from a couple of different funds, as well as 7 gay men that were compensated $1,300 for their suffering. Now, there may have been 100,000. I mean, we simply don't know. But most have never come forward, and there's reasons for this. Again, if you're subject to medical experiments, if homosexuality is outlawed in the country, you're not going to come forward and claim a status of being a victim or being victimized. So let me talk about, and then we'll look at part of the film today. I want to talk about 3 of the men in that film. Amazingly, I actually had a chance to meet both Gad Beck and Pierre Sell in Berlin at a conference in 2001, which had given rise to this this case where we were arguing that, the case that we were arguing for the Swiss banks was that so few gay men had survived, and given the post-war situation where they couldn't come forward, we thought that the Swiss bank's case should make a symbolic kind of payment for education and outreach and museums, almost like a symbolic payment of sorts to recognize their suffering. They decided against that for a number of reasons, which I can explain. But in this conference, 2 of the men featured in this film participated, one being Gad Beck and one being Pierre Sell. So the case of Pierre Sell was very interesting because he was French, and this is kind of almost contradicts what I was saying earlier, where they didn't track homosexuality outside of Germany. They thought Alsace-Lorraine belonged to Germany, which is where he was from, and they thought that because it was an area, territory lost after World War I. And so even though it was French-speaking and part of France in 1941, the Germans still were interested in tracking homosexuality from there. They arrested him in 1941. He was sent to a small labor camp where he was tortured. He witnessed, if you saw the film, some horrific things, including German shepherds apparently mauling and killing his lover. And for the next almost 40 years, he was in a closet. He didn't talk about it, didn't come out until 1981, where he decided, very late in his life to testify about what he experienced. And if you're interested, he wrote a really fascinating and difficult memoir called I, Pierre Sell, Deported Homosexual. And it's a memoir of what he went through both in the camp as well as about the post-war period of silence. In the case of Gad Beck, he only died a couple years ago, and he was interesting in a lot of different ways. One, he was Jewish and gay. He came from a mixed family, meaning his parents, one was Christian, one was Jewish. He was sometimes now considered the last homosexual survivor, although he's now dead. We don't know of any other survivors who were persecuted for being homosexual that are still alive today. He actually lived an underground life, and his book was called, I think, An Underground Life in Berlin. He survived largely through the help of other friends, and he talks about in the film the loss of his lover, who was Jewish, and the deportation of him, a man named Manfred, who was sent to Auschwitz with his family. And then I'll show you a clip about this, a man who is 92 years old in the film named Heinz F., who also, again, talks about these very unique aspects of the persecution of homosexuals, one being the fact that he never talked about it, and he couldn't for various reasons, and so, at the end of his life, it's almost confessional, but also the fact that he spent, extraordinary, like twice as much time as like most people in concentration camps. I imagine after the war, they weren't quite concentration camps, they were prisons or detention centers. And so he refers to them as concentration camps, but I think what he's saying is there's a continuity of persecution that he was imprisoned in a camp during the Nazis, he was imprisoned in a prison for the same crime in the post-war German period. And so this is, again, I think a unique part of this experience. So let me end by saying something about lesbians, and I'm going to look at a couple sections of the film. The only and the best systematic kind of like discussion of the situation of lesbians during the Third Reich is by a historian named Claudia Schoppmann. And if you're interested, the book is called Days of Masquerade, and it's about 10 life stories of women who went into hiding. They were identified as lesbian during the Nazi period and went into hiding during the period. When lesbians were targeted, and in some cases they were arrested, they were generally targeted as asocials, and so not as lesbian per se, and often if they received a triangle, it would have been a black triangle as opposed to a pink triangle, which was strictly reserved for men. I should say that the pink triangle, which is now generally turned right side up with the point upward, this was an invention of the Nazis, right? So in the same way that the Jews wore a yellow star with a J on it, gay men wore a pink triangle. Political prisoners wore a red triangle. Lesbians considered asocial wore a black triangle. Asocials were generally put into regular prisons as opposed to concentration camps. Generally what they were considered to be more like criminals, more like everyday criminals than a group that was to be systematically targeted. We do, however, know of hundreds of examples of lesbians considered to be asocial who were thought to be reformable if they were to work in camp brothels. And these were established for SS officers, often on the grounds of concentration camps. And so what you can extrapolate from there is that these women were probably raped, and probably raped, systematically for a long period of time. Unfortunately, we don't have any testimonies from women who are subject to this, nor any reparation cases where women have come forward. And so the 10 stories that are in here, these women were not part of the camp brothels. They're talking about how they went into hiding in order to avoid, in many ways, being found out or being imprisoned. So unfortunately, within the case of, I'd say the broader case of the history of homosexuality, a lot is still unknown. There's simply a lot of numbers and statistics and stories we don't know. And with regard to lesbians, we're really missing this part of the story, which talks about these experiences that the women who were forced to work in brothels suffered. So it's just, there's a lot of history that's still waiting to be, written. So before we look at the film, are there questions that you have about any of this? How the tracking worked? Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. So, starting in 1934, what happened was that there was an organization established by the Reich to track criminality. And criminality meant any kind of crimes that were, essentially outlawed. And then paragraph 175 represented one of those crimes. And so the German, this larger organization, which was part of the Gestapo, worked with local police to put together criminal lists. Now, interestingly, these criminal lists were sometimes made public. That is to say, the names were sometimes published in newspapers in order to out people and also to create kind of public denunciations. And sometimes this also meant that people were bribed, and you know, it destroyed families, obviously. Sometimes there was no basis for the charge. It wasn't as if they were like going in people's bedrooms and seeing what they were doing, but they were sometimes people were just being suspected homosexuals, and they ended up on these lists. And those lists then were used later to round up people, primarily from big cities, primarily Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, Cologne, where you would have had historically, you know, gay organizations, you know, like clubs and bars and organizations and what have you. And so those criminal lists that were produced in the early 30s were used to then deport homosexuals in the 1940s. And so my feeling about criminal lists is never, it's obviously never a good thing. And I'll talk about this on Thursday. But criminal lists, which were doing one thing in the 1930s, ended up doing something very different in the 1940s. Oh, yeah, they just turned it upside down. Yeah. Yeah, mainly like, you know, mainly this goes back to the organization ACT UP and fighting AIDS activism in the 1990s. They used the triangle, but never upside down like this. They always use it facing this way. And the idea of silence equals death is a kind of a mantra of ACT UP. And I'd say AIDS or activism and gay organizations, mainly in the American but also European context. And so the idea was like this triangle pointing downward is like the badge that the Nazis used as a brand, essentially a branding of people. And then they're taking an existing symbol and turning it around, but also to kind of revalue it of sorts, you know, as a symbol of pride rather than of shame. So I just want to show you two parts of the film. And there's a lot of stuff in this film that I find, you know, very, all the stuff is very moving. I find this particularly moving because they're often, the two men that I want to show you are three men. One's Gad Beck here talking about an experience where he lost his lover. And then after that, there's a part where Pierre Sale kind of explodes with regard to the historian who's interviewing him to talk about really the shame that had been so characteristic of why he never came forward or talked about what he went through. And then finally, the testimony by Heinz F., where he talks not only about shame, but also about the silence and the additional time that he served, again, that characterizes the experience of this persecuted group and these men. So there's a couple of sections I want to talk about, and you know, in many ways this speaks for itself. So I'm not going to provide a lot of commentary, but I'm going to play a couple of parts for you. It's on German, obviously. So he's Jewish. It's So one thing, he's talking, Große Hamburger Straße is a famous street in Berlin, which was primarily a Jewish quarter in Berlin. And he went to a Jewish school there, and Manfred, who was also Jewish, was arrested in probably the same street and maybe the same, and held in a kind of a holding place before his family was sent to Auschwitz. And so he's now going to talk about this effort to get Manfred out, his boyfriend.
Hör mal, sagt er, mein Sohn ist doch so groß wie du. Der hat die Hitlerjugenduniform. Gehst du drin, holst du mir raus, den Manfred? Ich ging die große Hamburger, ging da rein. Herr Lippe, ich möchte den Obersturmbannführerschein. Und Fritze dort. Da sie bringen den auf den zurück. Ich sag, was soll ich denn mit den Juden? Und geh mit ihm raus. Aus meiner Schule. 20, 30 Meter etwa. Ich weiß genau, welche Stelle es ist. Gebe ihm 20 Mark, die nimmt er auch und sage ihm, du fährst jetzt zum Onkel Bobby. Du weißt doch, ich telefoniere mit ihm und dann treffen wir uns dort. Ich komme dorthin. Und er bleibt stehen und sagt ganz ruhig, aber also ohne jede Erregung, ich kann mit dir nicht kommen, Katze. Wenn ich jetzt meine Familie verlasse, die kranke Familie, bin ich in meinem Leben nie frei mehr. Ich habe mit ihm zu leben. Ich bin der einzige, starke und kräftige. Sagt nicht auf Wiedersehen, dreht sich um und geht zurück in meinen Stuhl. Ich blieb entgegengesetzt von ihm fort. Ohne dass ich denken konnte, hatte ich den Eindruck, hier ist etwas für ewig zerbrochen worden.
So he was, 21. Yeah, so I'm going to scoot up a tiny bit more. I want to show you two other parts that, again, very difficult, I think, to watch, but I think worth watching. Let me see if this will go. Okay, it's restarted. Let's see. Come on. Darn. Okay, I'll try one more time. Let's see if we can get it. Seems like it wants to play. All right, let me see if I can reload it real quick. Yes? Okay, cool. Okay, so the section I want to show you is Pierre Sale, and it's right around. Actually, right around here. So this is Pierre Sale, who I mentioned before was the one who was arrested. Apparently, he was put on a list first, is how I understand his story. So one of these criminal lists, and then he was arrested later for being gay. And so he talks about extraordinary torture that happened in this camp where he was sent. And this particular scene, I think, it's important because he expresses really the outrage in the post-war situation about not being recognized at all for the suffering that he went through. So I'm going to play this without much commentary.
Wo ich 40 Jahre lang nichts gesagt habe und ich bin 90%ig Kriegsinvalide. Ne? Mein Arsch ist noch blöder, ja genau. Die Nazis haben mir Häusen von 25 Zentimeter in den Arsch gemacht. Glauben Sie, dass ich das sagen kann, dass es für mich gut ist, dass ich sage, für meine Neffen ist das zu viel, Klaus, das kann ich nicht mehr, ich kann es nicht mehr machen. Ich habe eine Schäme für die Menschheit, als eine Hunde.
So this is the last one. So this is the last one I want to show you, and this is Heinz F. So here's the other man. And this is the part where he talks about, again, I say a combination of the shame, but also the duration of his imprisonment.
Konzentrationslager gewesen? Zusammen. Wir haben mal zusammengerechnet. Ich glaube 8 Einsätze gehabt. Was haben Sie gemacht, als Sie zurückkamen? Ja, wie nach Hause kamen. Ja, dann ins Geschäft, elterliche Geschäfte kam, dass mein Bruder führte, mein Vater war ja gestorben. Jahre überlebt haben und zurückkamen und
keine darüber sprechen konnten. Ja. Nie mit jemandem darüber gesprochen.
hätten Sie gern mit jemandem darüber gesprochen?
Vielleicht. Vielleicht mit einem.
Haben Sie später mit anderen darüber sprechen können?
Nie. Es wollte auch keiner hören. Wenn man bloß irgendein Stichwort sagte oder so. Also bist du mit dem Kram zufrieden. Es wäre nur vorbei und damit ist erledigt.
Okay. So, I don't hear any reactions, but obviously difficult to watch. Any questions or thoughts? Okay. So, yeah, Thursday, what I'd like you to do, I'll add some information about some memorials. Perhaps I'll show you there's a gay memorial actually in Berlin now, so maybe I'll put that up there. And yeah, to think about just sort of, yeah, where do we go now? Thanks.